Hi, I'm the Wrong Hero, and I'm back again for another thrilling installment of our 10-part series on comedy. This is part 4, and it's perhaps the part that you've all been waiting for, and it's called Stand Up. Now, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I still have some unintended business from the last week to deal with, and that concerns note-taking techniques of the stand-up comedian. Now, Lionel Leverage, the biographer of Tennessee Williams, said that Tennessee Williams was characterized by mental self-exposure, the intrusion of self-consciousness into experience, and he called this the worst curse of writing. Now, it has been said also of Ernest Gellner that being right, he believed, often mattered less than throwing out good ideas to be proved wrong. And of course, since I'm the wrong hero, I wholeheartedly agree with that particular characterization of, incidentally, what a comedian does. Throwing out good ideas to be proved wrong. Inspiration, thinks inventor Dr. Nakamatsu, is most likely to strike when the brain is starved of oxygen. Well, I don't know about that particular insight. Now, Berlin Klinkenberg has said that genius is somewhere between serendipity and slavery to your craft, and that is certainly the case with the stand-up comedian, or for that matter, virtually any successful writer. Slavery to your craft. James Burrows says that I just keep spewing and 50% of what I say is shit. But you can't just keep doing the same scene over and over again. And the same is very true of jokes. You just can't keep doing the same jokes over and over. You have to be continuously creating new material. Jay Leno once said that he believed that most comedians were lazy and would, in fact, do the same jokes over and over if they thought they could get away with it. Now, Thomas Hardy has a wonderful idea, which incidentally is also a very good idea for a stand-up comedian to generate new material. He says that you should make a list of things which everybody thinks and nobody says, and a list of things which everybody says and nobody thinks. And some examples are of things that everybody says but nobody thinks is something like good dog, as a snarling beast comes lunging practically straight at your throat. Now, Guillaume Apollinaire had a useful insight about generating ideas. He said, when man tried to imitate walking, he created the wheel, which does not resemble a leg. He then performed an act of surrealism without realizing it. And that, in fact, in essence, is our task, to imitate walking, but not by creating a new pair of feet, but by creating the wheel. Now, William Morris says that there is no art without resistance to the materials. And that is certainly very much the case. Your materials will, in fact, continually resist your attempts to shape them into some sort of more or less malleable form. The stand-up comedian is constantly revising his material, working it, as they call it, to get the maximum amount of laughs, to wrench the consciousness of the audience into the point where it gets as many laughs as it possibly can. For example, I once stated that my apartment smelled like Frankenstein's tonsils, and then I thought, well, maybe Frankenstein's dentures would be a more vivid image, but now I'm beginning to think perhaps Frankenstein's boudoir would be, in fact, an even more imaginative image. Now, R.C. Binstock, the novelist, who in fact lives here in Cambridge, says, you are not the boss of the work is the boss of you. The work doesn't come if it thinks you want control, and it's very important not to have expectations for the result. You have to demonstrate good faith and commitment, and then you will find what work is in you to be accomplished. So if you're the sort of person that thinks of funny ideas all the time, then perhaps you are a stand-up comedian in the making and you don't even realize it. R.C. Binstock goes on to say, by forcing yourself into the terrifying and very difficult process of making something up, by trusting yourself to get it right, you find out what you know. Often that has a beauty, a strength, and a resonance beyond that which you might have deliberately arranged. He also goes on further to state, when you discover what you know, but what you didn't think you knew with facility, then you are an artist. And finally, to quote R.C. Binstock one last time, the main thing is the experience. There were explorers who wanted to go off to explore terra incognita in early modern Europe. They wanted the experience without knowing what it would be like. They wanted to go for the experience. That's the approach the artist has to have. You do the thing because it is thrilling, because you have to, even if you don't necessarily feel like it. I have an offer to do a 1-hour show down in Westerly, Rhode Island in June for a high school graduation ceremony. I don't necessarily want to do it. I'm not sure they can pay me enough for the amount of work that it's going to take to prepare for such a show, but nevertheless, I am committing myself to do it should I be selected to do it, because you have to go for the experience, as R.C. Binstock so wisely stated. Now, I hope you have your VCR fired up. I'm afraid I'm going to be going a little bit fast. I believe I have a little more material than I have time to present it in, and this will probably be an ongoing process for the next few weeks of this presentation, which I should remind you is The Wrong Heroes, History of Comedy, or let's say History of Comedy in America. Comedic Techniques is basically the focus of this week's monologue, as well as the life of the stand-up comedian, which was, in fact, incidentally, the core element of this presentation as it was originally intended to be presented as a class, which I never got the chance to teach because not enough people sign up for it. But I have all this time to fill, and I have all this material ready, so I'm figuring I might as well do it. E.B. White said that it's best to have strong curiosity and weak affiliations. And I think what he means by that is, like James Joyce used to always want to find out everything he possibly could about an individual or a subject before he wrote about it. And I think it's a very good thing for a stand-up comedian to keep in mind, or a humorist of any kind, or a writer for that matter, to find out as much as you can. And you can't really worry too much about whether you're going to hurt the subject should he or she recognize him or his or herself in what you're saying, because you have to have strong curiosity and weak affiliations. It is something of a monastic life. E.B. White also states that one should shun verbal infirmity and euphemistic softness, which means one mustn't take the most roundabout and circumlocucious way of stating a simple fact, at least not unless one is doing it for comic effect, as I once saw in a Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny cartoon. Clear writing is medicinal, says Daniel Aaron. It checks the spread of linguistic contagion. And, of course, stating something clearly is of the essence when doing stand-up comedy, unless, again, one manages to wrench a humorous effect from palpable obscurity. If you get deeply into almost any subject, says Ben Stein, it becomes interesting. And that is certainly the case. Justin Green, in his 2-page cartoon, visualization and conceptualization, or whatever it was called, he says that you can try to more or less make a laundry list of things that sort of revolve around the idea you are attempting to write about. And sometimes that laundry list will yield results which would not have come had you simply confined yourself to the matter at hand. Without inventive language, says Derek Bickerton, abstract thought is impossible. And, well, that is something to ponder. If we had time, I would allow a long pause to settle in hereabouts, but I'll repeat it. Without inventive language, abstract thought is impossible. You can work your way around abstract concepts if you think of the proper metaphors and similes to do it. Magic, says Norman Mailer, speaking of Picasso, magic offers priceless energy. If you can, if you can feel the magic of what you're doing, then you will be energized to accomplish that much more. The moral connotations of subversion have been reversed, says Jackson Lears. Back in the 50s, subversion, of course, meant communist subversion, but in the 60s, subversion meant working your way around, quote unquote, the establishment, and that is still, to a certain degree, very much what a stand-up comedian does. Work one's way around established things, pointing out the absurdities of them. That is something that satirists have always done. Revision includes pulling material together into a logically ordered narrative, says Flo King. And this is something that many comedians, when they're first starting out, they don't have enough material to be able to pull it all in so that one thing segues neatly into another, or they don't have enough material to do 5 minutes on just one topic. I'm not trying to blow my own horn here, but I am getting to the point where I can do 5 minutes on virtually any topic, and about 90% of it will be stuff I've already thought of. Too bad I don't have my notebooks in any logical order, or else I'd be out there every night doing a different set every night of the week. Revision includes pulling material together into a logically ordered narrative. Now, that's very fine to say, but teaching one how to do this is another matter altogether. Now, what you can do is come up with some sort of parameters in which to do this. Mine is called Jackdaws Love My Big Sphinx of Quartz, and each letter of that phrase includes one bit of subject matter. For example, J stands for Jesus, which stands for religion, and subset science. A stands for animals, dogs, cats, and the like. C, gee, I don't know what C stands for. Cars, I guess. Transportation. K stands for kibitzers, the heckle lines that every comedian has to memorize so that if you should be heckled on stage, you can zing right back with something that's appropriate to the moment, which often generates the biggest laugh. D, well, it stands for drugs, medicine, doctors, dentists. A, again, that's just animals. W stands for work and leisure, and so that covers jackdaws. That's my mnemonic device. I can arrange an entire set of new material simply by slotting it into those parameters and then coming up with the segues, because that's what I'm comfortable with. Now, James Joyce moved in his art, speaking of James Joyce, moved in his art from the monadic to the polyphonic, the chordal, trying to encompass the teeming complexity of the human mind in every split second. Now, I'm not sure that's necessarily what the stand-up comedian must do, but there are basically three things that a comedian is doing. He is presenting the material on stage as he has memorized it, and yet he is also doing it in such a way that it wells up from his subconscious. He's rehearsed it so much that it just springs up, and he can add to it or delete it at will. And at the same time, he's also utilizing body language in order to get his point across that much more effectively. A comedian who just stands there and hugs the microphone, as it was said Woody Allen did early in his career, 1963, 1964, as a stand-up comedian, well, you can wrench humorous effects out of that as well, but the body language adds so much more to it. It's sort of like the gravy on top of the mashed potatoes. We should demand that entertainment should, in order to be entertaining, come couched in something like sense. You can't just get up there and babble nonsense and expect to get a laugh. The things not only have to make sense in and of themselves, but they have to be connected in such a way that also makes a sort of intuitive sense, even if it's the intuition, the intuitiveness of the sense is confined only to the comedian's brain. There has to be some sort of organic process where everything stitches together. You should sit down to write only when you feel cold as ice, says Chekhov. That's sort of along Irma Bombeck or Heloise's advice that you should only clean your closets when you're in a bad mood, or you should only go grocery shopping when your stomach is full. It's almost like, you know, when you're disgusted with the world, then it's that much easier to just churn out reams of material. That's how the artist creates triumph out of adversity. The blues musician created great art out of suffering. It's unfortunate that people think that you have to bleed for your art. It's not necessarily the case, but there is some component of art whereby you, you engage in the creation of it in order to redress what you perceive, at least, as past wrongs generally done to you. There are some people who can get really angry about society and the wrongs that it does to abstract groups of people. But I think for the most part, many artists react most of all to the wrongs that were done to them to some degree, whether they perceive them as wrongs from one individual to another or wrongs of the society as a whole. And yet, Harrison Keeler points out that you can't just put this stuff directly on the page and bore people who don't have the opportunity to bore you right back. You have to translate it. You have to push it through some sort of filter where it becomes more universal. It would appeal to somebody who doesn't necessarily even know you and doesn't even necessarily have to believe that it really happened. That's what the artist does in creating, and that's the problem with showing your material to people who know you. They like you, they know you. They'll laugh at something because it's you, and not necessarily because it's funny in an abstract way. Not necessarily because if some comic came up and said it on stage, they might not laugh at it, but because it's you, they'll think it's funny. And yet there's another way of creating art in which you create art only to appeal to a select circle of your friends, and not necessarily for a wider audience that, of course, is very difficult to encapsulate or stereotype. In other words, if you could please a group of discerning friends, then you're probably creating pretty good art. So there are two opposing streams of thought. Michael Glitz says that well-intentioned mush is the most unhelpful mush of all. And I think what he's getting at is the difference between sentimentality and sentiment. Sentiment is feeling, but sentimentality is a gross corruption of that feeling. You're wrenching the feeling one way or another and making it false because you're falsifying in order to create an effect. So be careful when you decide to crusade for some sort of cause and expect it to be humorous. You can crusade for the cause of humanity versus those forces which attempt to quash it. But when you get more specific than that, then you're beginning to sound like you're on a soapbox. It is one thing simply to get your point across, says Tom Shachtman, citing T.L. Simmons. It is another to do so with economy and flair, which bears upon skills of articulation, along with an ability to use logic, an ability to listen properly, and a supple vocabulary. Jerry Seinfeld said that most comedians could benefit from taking a course in logic because much stand-up material is simply things which would make logical sense in one context, but the comedian wrenches them to a certain degree into a context in which they no longer make logical sense, but you have to have some grounding in logic in order to be able to understand what logical fallacy is being committed in the course of creating this material. An ability to listen properly. You get some of your best material just from listening to other people, to what they have to say, and a supple vocabulary. That is key, not only for a stand-up comedian but for a writer in general. It's really helpful if you have two or three different ways to say things, because in that way you can vary your material, even in the process of relating it. You'll discover that if you memorize a monologue, but you don't memorize it perfectly, you might tell it once, and then the next time you tell it, it'll be slightly different. Some of the words will be changed. You'll use certain synonyms to recreate. And in the stand-up comedian, this process is ongoing and subconscious. You try out new things almost without realizing you're going to do it until the moment the words come out of your mouth. Now, to wrap up this segment on note-taking techniques, Gene Parrott, who lists himself as Bob Hope's gag writer, I'm only allowed to quote up to 500 words of his. He has a book called Great One-Liners, which of course is useful not so that you can steal them outright from the book, but so that you can use them to generate ideas for your own one-liners on similar topics. He also sets out the one-liners in such a way that they are divided into subject headings, and you could those as your parameters to slowly gather your material and put them into variegated slots. Gene Parrott states that a one-liner is a funny, creative, clever response to a situation. Just as an answer cannot exist without a corresponding question, so a one-liner can't exist without a setup. The setup can be another sentence, a question, a situation. The setup can even be self-contained or implied. The one-liner, which is a traditional show business joke form, doesn't necessarily mean a one-sentence gag. Then why call it a one-liner? Because one of the lines is essential. One of the lines is the punchline. That's the one line that makes it a joke. If the one line is sharp, incisive, creative, clever, funny, then you have a great one-liner. Yevgeny Yevchenko stated that maturity is measured by the number of lost illusions. Now, as you grow older, that is to say, as you become part of the market for country and western music, after you've been knocked around a little bit, you will discover that, yes, indeed, maturity is measured by the number of lost illusions. Like when you're, say, 22, you think you're going to take over the world. And by the time you're 32, you think, well, maybe that plan will have to be delayed for a while. And by the time you're 42, well, forget about it. If you haven't taken it over by then, well, you're in the wrong profession or something, you know. Now, by taking over the world, I don't necessarily mean the world as a whole, but simply your world. So this is a fertile source of comedic humor. The notion that when one was young, one thought one could accomplish anything. As one grew older, one discovered that that, in fact, was not indeed the case. So now, if you're ready, we are going to proceed in earnest to Chapter 4 of our presentation, which is titled Monologists and Storytellers, the World of Stand-Up Comedians. And in it, if there's time, I'll also be talking about techniques of memorization and pacing. Now, someone, I'm not quite sure who, said that if you were going to pay money for jokes, on the whole, you'd rather it was for jokes you hadn't already thought of yourself. And there's a very good and vital reason why this is, in fact, the very first thing that I placed in this particular subject heading. Because you can't get up on stage and say things that people believe they could have thought of themselves. Because although they may laugh, there's an even better chance that they might, in fact, groan. To give an example, I do this bit about how smelly my apartment is, how squalid it is. It's a staple of the stand-up monologue. It's a good starting point. Talk about your environment and then branch out from there. And I say that the refrigerator has a sign on it that says biohazard free. Now anybody could have thought of that. In fact, there are quite a few jokesters who do in fact have little signs that say biohazard on their refrigerator. It's a sort of college thing, or radioactive materials or something like that. Something they took from some lab or something, they stick it on there. So what you have to do is you use that as a starting point, but you can't allow that to bear the whole weight of the humor. You have to go on from there. And in fact, if this were about me doing my material, then I would in fact get into it. At some future point, and during the Live at AS220 tape, which will air sometime in May or June, or the Live at Cafe Liberty tape, which will also air sometime in May or June, you will get a chance to see how I develop that, if in fact you watch this show diligently every week, as is to be hoped, although considering the shows that it's stacked up against, I very much doubt anybody watches the show in its entirety. Now, one of the things that I'm not quoting because I made it up myself is that time is the poor writer's best editor. If you let something sit for 30 days, then you'll begin to see it with a dispassionate eye. And if you let it sit for 30 weeks, then you will certainly be able to see it with a dispassionate eye. You will be able to regard it as though someone else wrote it. And if you have any editorial skills at all, you will be able to see where you can chop and channel. You can shorten it, revise it, or perhaps lengthen it, make it carry more weight. That's why I believe that the stand-up comedian should try to come up with 5 new minutes of material every week. Now, that of course will take a great deal of your time. That is approximately 30 jokes, depending on your pacing. When I say jokes, I don't necessarily mean one-liners, but let's say 30 hot spots, 30 hooks, 6 hooks a minute. Now, that's quite a bit. I only manage about 3, personally. So let's say that we were to have this and say, okay, you got to come up with 15, good jokes, 30 jokes, cut that by half. Go through them and see which ones aren't quite as good as they could be. Cut them out and do 15 really good jokes every week. Have an A list and a B list. A list is stuff that you've done. It was funny to you when you came up with it. It was funny to an audience when you performed it, and it was funny more than once or twice or 3 times. Then you know that is part of your A list. Whereas the B list will be more like things that could be funny if you work them out some more, if you either develop the implications of them or you manage to present them in a somewhat more clipped and condensed style. Frequently, the humor of a gag or a joke or a one-liner is in its very brevity. But and if you made a career of writing nothing but brief one-liners, you would be faced with the problem of coming up with ways to link them in such a fashion that you could in fact come up with a 5-minute monologue based entirely on one-liners. So for many comedians, they would prefer to come up with a monologue of 5 minutes in length with many individual discrete parts which all bear on one topic. And of course this is somewhat more difficult than coming up with, say, 15 individual jokes about totally different topics. You have to work at it more. Now, Elizabeth Bishop, I actually studied under Elizabeth Bishop, and she was very serious about her craft. And a fellow named James Buchanan wrote about Elizabeth Bishop. He said, "The stages through which great verse is made. You read every poet you can. Every poet you can find in 4 or 5 languages in his or her letters and work till you drop." Well, you don't necessarily have to listen to every comedian that has ever existed on earth in 4 or 5 different languages. One will do quite nicely. Although the eras in which comedians work, in fact, operate to a certain degree as de facto languages. The comedians such as Jack Benny or Bob Hope, who had their heyday, say, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, or George Burns, they'll be very different from the comedians like, say, Jack Parr, Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, Dick Gregory, who had their heyday in the 50s and 60s. And of course, they in turn will be very different from the comedians who we could think of as having had their heyday in the 70s. Robert Klein, Burns and Schreiber, George Carlin, Cheech and Chong, people like that. They operate with a different sense of timing, a different comic syntax, and to a certain degree, they utilize differing subject matters. The comic who came up by doing shows for GIs during World War II will be very different from the generation which arose during the time of the Vietnam War. One was a good war, the other was a bad war, and so your jokes told to GIs during World War II will center around army life, the officiousness of officers, and things like that, whereas the subversion of the 70s comic, who deals with things like an oppressive government as opposed to merely an oppressive non-commissioned officer. See, there's that degree of difference. And of course the comics who came up in the 80s, Sam Kinison, Bob Goldthwait, Steve Wright, they in turn are going to be very different from folks like George Carlin or Robert Klein, who came up in the 70s. And of course we have a whole crew of comics who are coming up here in the 90s. Sinbad, Carrot Top, they all seem to have one-word names. Can't say I necessarily approve of them, but then again, you see, I must be trapped in the 80s. That's when I started out doing this, although even as early as 1975, I was in fact doing something like this. I was doing sketch humor over the radio in 1975, but there was a long hiatus. Then I was doing comic writing during the late 70s, which never really went anywhere. Then I got into serious writing in the early 80s, and then I got back into comedy in the mid 80s, and I've been doing it for close to 11 years come this August. Letting it all hang out, says Ian Baruma, does not create a work of art. Transforming one's feelings into something else can do so, but that takes talent and discipline. And the operative phrase here is transforming one's feelings into something else. You have a definite feeling about something. First, you're able to articulate it. And then, once you're able to articulate it, at least mentally, then you're able to transcribe it to a certain degree. And once you're able to transcribe it, then you can work it. Work the material, shape it into some sort of form which will enable you to transmit it to a group, not necessarily even of like-minded individuals, although that's always very helpful. That's why the established comedian has it so much easier than somebody who doesn't have any sort of following whatsoever, because it's like he has a ready-made audience, and they're there to hear what he has to say because they've been attracted to what he has had to say. But getting to that point, you see, that's the difficulty. And of course you can go the low road, which is to say something which everybody can agree with, or you can go the high road. Please yourself and hope enough like-minded individuals are out there to follow along with what you have to say. Now, if you're funny enough, I think eventually you will be heard and you will be recognized. As Yeats said, in lines that are frequently misquoted from the poem The Second Coming, the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of a passionate intensity. I may be misquoting them myself, but that's something that resonates, I think. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of a passionate intensity. Now, if you do have convictions and you can summon up a certain degree of passionate intensity about them, to the degree that you're willing to enslave yourself to this craft, then you really have something. Dennis Diderot, quoting George Wills in the book Certain Trumpets, Dennis Diderot said that the best actor sits inside his own performance as a cool spectator of the effect he is creating in an audience. Now, it helps if you have audio or video tape equipment so that you can, in fact, see how the audience is reacting and hear how the audience is reacting later when you're not on stage. The best actor sits inside his own performance as a cool spectator of the effect he is creating in an audience. The actor is working at several different levels of awareness, fiery in the character's emotions, icy in the adjustment of these emotions to the intended result in onlookers. Feigned tears must lead to real tears, and to twist this around a little bit, feigned laughter must lead to real laughter. Now, one technique of comedy, which I find very interesting, that Steve Jones posited, was to stand in front of an audience and simulate insanity. Of course, you can tell, judging from my appearance, that I am the most sane and rational of individuals. And now we're going to get a little bit into specific stand-up comedians. When I went through that whole thing about the 60s and 70s, one very important figure who is in a direct line of descent from Lenny Bruce, of course, is Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor, according to one individual, didn't simply tell stories, he brought them to life. And in order to not simply tell stories, but to bring them to life, not only do you have to use different voices, different personas, not only do you have to be able to get inside the head of different people in order to create dialogues between individuals who are recognizably not you, but you also have to be able to use body language, sound effects, certain motions, body language shorthand, like that means he's dead, and that means all right. You have to know these things at least on a subconscious level. In fact, it's best if you know them on a subconscious level. Just as a blues musician may not necessarily have to know how to read music, and in fact may be hindered by an ability to read music. Although I'm not quite sure that is strictly the case. I think that the more you know, the better. That's my personal opinion. But There are some gifted individuals who may not be very literate. They may in fact be dyslexic, but they have to work around that impediment. So many dyslexic individuals have a large vocabulary simply because, or many people who stutter develop a large vocabulary because if they can't say one word, they have to have another word ready that they can say, that they can pop in there, which is synonymous. I've always maintained, says Darwin, that excepting fools, men do not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work. And I don't want to preach to you or get too heavy duty about this thing about hard work, but that's what comedy is, hard work. And I'm only going to say this once. One comedian characterized it as you got to fuck it and you got to suck it. You got to just keep on working on the material, keep working. Of course, H.L. Mencken once said, if only we were two individuals, one to work and one to observe. But unfortunately, we only have one life to live, and that's an end to it. You just have to, if you don't have much time, you've got to make the time. And if you can't make the time, then perhaps you're going to proceed a lot more slowly than if you had unlimited time. But unlimited time is a danger too. H.L. Mencken, quoting him once again, said that most writers create all of their best work in 3 hours. You only need 3 hours a day in which to write. After that, the quality of the material starts to fall off, unless, of course, you're somebody who has been doing it for 20 years, and you can probably sit down at the typewriter at 7 a.m. and keep right on working until 2 with maybe a break for a cup of coffee. Now, Esar's Comic Encyclopedia is a treasure trove of material, which unfortunately is of an earlier era, the 20s and 30s, and not necessarily directly applicable to the type of material comedians are expected to use today. However, in Esar's Comic Encyclopedia, it states, there is a definition of a joke as, a brief single incident, a comic tale stripped of all non-essential detail. It begins with a situation, has no middle, and ends with a surprise, an unexpected twist. I will give an example. I think I may have used this example before. It's the one that springs most readily to mind. I like to spend hours in the bathtub. Sometimes I even put water in there. There is an example of a brief single incident, a tale stripped of all non-essential detail, which begins with a situation, I like to spend hours in the bathtub, has no middle, just a pause, and ends with a surprise. Sometimes I even put water in there. An unexpected twist. Now, citing Esar's Comic Encyclopedia again, in one-line rejoinders to greetings, the humor flows from the participants' commonly held satiric view of the world and themselves. Humor in those instances is not based on an unexpected twist or reversal. On the contrary, it is derived from an acknowledgement of the shared ironic attitude underlying the quip. Quick rejoinders or clever quips are admired, however, when they are spontaneous reactions to real situations and humorously underscore an alternative view. They are often a form of signifying, and the put-down can be devastating. For example, somebody heckled me once, and I said, Lord, give me patience now. And that appeared to be so spontaneous, even though it was practical, it was carefully rehearsed. It appeared so spontaneous that it got the biggest laugh of the night. Now, says Freud, also from Esar's Comic Encyclopedia, some degree of benevolence or a kind of neutrality, an absence of any factor that could provoke feelings opposed to the purpose of the joke, is an indispensable condition if the third person is to collaborate in the completion of the process of making a joke. In other words, if you get up there and you start doing ethnic material based around a person's ethnicity which is not one that you happen to share, then you will not get much sympathy from an audience, particularly not from those members of the audience who happen to be the victim ethnicity that you are putting down without yourself being a part of the ethnicity. That's why you can do ethnic material if you acknowledge that you are in fact a part of that ethnic group. You can do the Italian Catholic jokes, particularly in a room full of Italian Catholics, and if you yourself are an Italian Catholic and you demonstrate this fact by knowing what Italian Catholics do, then that is the kind of benevolence or at least neutrality, an absence of any feeling that could provoke feelings opposed to the purpose of the joke. That's when you have that, when you are in fact a part of the in-group that you are in fact criticizing without really criticizing, because it's more like you're celebrating it. The best material, says Lily Tomlin, makes a comment without ridiculing and includes everyone in the comment. A lot of comedians do self-deprecating humor, such as, say, Rodney Dangerfield. And of course, the reason he is so successful, one of the many reasons, besides the fact that he works 18 hours a day, what he does is that his best material makes a comment without ridiculing anybody but himself, and it includes everyone in the comments. But you see, such is his mastery of the form that rather than provoking feelings of mere sympathy, he provokes riotous gales of laughter. Every joke calls for a public of its own, and laughing at the same jokes is evidence of far-reaching physical conformity, says Freud. And that's why a great many comedians in their 20s and 30s work to audiences who are also in their 20s and 30s, because of this factor, this factor of fellow feeling, which a good comedian can use to his advantage. John Ruskin had a description of a contemporary as a man who thought by infection, catching opinions like colds. Now, one line that has been used is that, you know, these black boxes in planes, you always hear about these plane crashes, and the only thing that survives is the black box. Why not create the plane out of the black box? My friend Fred Bates has a joke. Psychic fairs. Why do psychic fairs have to advertise? And you see, this is an example of thinking by infection, catching opinions like colds, things that you might have thought about but not too much. That is, to a certain degree, what the comedian does. He takes the thoughts of his contemporaries and formulates them into humorous material. What kind of stories do people like to hear? What kind of pictures do they like to have you paint for them? Their families, their friends, their co-workers, their relatives, their pets, themselves, and other people are what they relate to best. Heroes and villains, city and country, young and old, stories are driven by opposition. Louis Menand said that 3 basic subjects in American life are sex, violence, and money. Now, let's repeat this. What kind of stories do people like to hear? Their families, their friends, their co-workers, their relatives, their pets, themselves, and other people. And more importantly, heroes and villains, city and country, young and old. Stories are driven by opposition. That's why so many comedians do what I would call brand name humor. They take well-known names and they attribute characteristics to them, which then can be joked about. Jack Benny used to joke about his cheapness, for example, and other comedians would take up the ball. Phyllis Diller would joke about her inability to cook, and again, other comedians like Joey Adams will take up the ball and ascribe things to her which she does not necessarily ascribe to herself. Benny becomes a synonym for cheapness, and Diller becomes a synonym for slovenliness, and you can think of any of a number of examples of this phenomena. Mike Tyson, say, becomes a synonym for toughness and irresponsibility. Michael Jackson becomes a synonym for weirdness. O.J. Simpson, depending on your feelings, of duplicity. That's why Jay Leno gets so much mileage, and for that matter, David Letterman gets so much mileage out of O.J.'s search for the real killers. You can't overestimate the importance of cultivating a seemingly contrary point of view, says the wrong hero. You cannot overestimate the importance of cultivating a seemingly contrary point of view. You don't want to be contrary to everything. People get tired of that rather quickly. But you do want to develop a mindset where you think funny. It's called the comic frame. You look at something and you try to imagine how it would be if things were either slightly altered or totally reversed. For example, I like to say, everybody else always ruins it for a few assholes. And that's funny sometimes. Yet, it is also important to cut to the heart of an incident, render it in your own words and in the shortest manner possible. In other words, brevity is the soul of wit. You want to cut to the heart of a situation. That is why so many people who essay to tell jokes as opposed to doing monologues or one-liners, so many people do the monotonous three, the step one, step two, step three type of joke. They think that that's funny. That's an older form of comedy. It's an anecdotal form of comedy. It's a more rural than urban form of comedy. It is more slowly paced. Part of the humor in these sorts of story jokes or shaggy dog stories is, in fact, in their very circuitousness. It is a style which Mark Twain specialized in, and you might want to refer to his How to Tell a Humorous Story if you wish to see an example of this very thing. Gershon Legman says that this is, in fact, an example of the speaker taking an undue amount of attention and attracting it to his or herself. It's a form of aggression to tell these long, virtually pointless stories, which it's almost like sadism to inflict them on people, and people recognize that, and they squirm. And if the punchline isn't strong enough, then the desired laugh will not result. It's like tickling. Tickling is slightly painful, and yet it makes you laugh. And that's why you can't tickle yourself, because you know you're not going to hurt yourself. Now, it is also important, according to J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, in his advice to journalists, to write about the small, everyday events of your own existence. These accounts will sell. You are a virtual gold mine of material just in your everyday doings. That is why it's important not to spend all of your time writing material. You have to engage other people. You have to be out in the world, and you have to mingle. That's where your comic material is going to come from. It is the life's blood of your ability to come up with material, this interaction with other people. The one skill, says Anne Applebaum, the one skill journalists must possess, that is, if journalists can be said to possess any skills at all, is the ability to recognize an exciting piece of news when they hear it. This, however, can be more difficult than the layman can imagine. Recognizing an exciting piece of news when they hear it. Now, if you're the sort of person who likes to gather their material from magazines, like I am, then you also have the ability to recognize something that's really bizarre, that you can later turn to humorous account. Several years ago, there was an account of an individual who put a sign in his car window down in New York City which said, no radio. And this is a true story. Somebody came along, smashed the window, turned the sign over, and wrote on the back of it, get one. Now, the difference between a person who would relate this story as a matter-of-fact happening and a comedian is that a comedian would, in fact, be able to present it with the appropriate body language and intonations to make it even more funny. In other words, I told the story in a more or less conventional way. A way to present it is a humorous monologue would be, I was down in New York and I saw this car with a sign in the window and it said, no radio. So I broke that window, I took the sign, and I wrote on the back of it, get one. And then I stole the car. A writer, says Stephen Stark, is someone who has something to say, not someone who has to say something. And this, of course, I don't want to be put in a position where I appear to be nagging at fledgling comedians, but there's a vast difference between someone who has something to say and someone who has to say something. And I have seen this more times than I care to relate. Every life is a story waiting to be told. That does not necessarily mean that every story waiting to be told is necessarily worth telling unless one either embellishes it or strips it down to its bare essentials. Well, a comic, says Ed Wynn, a famous comedian of the 30s, a comic is one who opens a funny door. That's what I've been saying all along. The comic frame, the ability to think funny. Stephen Canfor twists this saying and states that a comedian is one who opens a door funny. And again, there is that aspect of physical humor to comedy that is very important. Now, Nietzsche said in his Mixed Opinions and Maxims, a joke is the epigram on the death of a feeling. And again, this is what I've been saying all along. You take things that have happened to you, which may or may not have made you feel sad, and you transform them into comedic material. And so to that degree, Nietzsche is correct. A joke is the epigram on the death of a feeling. Once you no longer have once you no longer have so much of your feelings invested in this incident, then you can recreate it as humorous material. Now, I will, in fact, for the next few minutes, state some of my own lecture notes, which are not, in fact, quotes. A whole page, in fact, of nothing but insights by the wrong hero about comedy. A good artist makes his or her artistry appear effortless, but it is this very effortlessness which attracts so much envy from people who fail to appreciate how much effort goes into creating the effect of effortlessness. It's the old, I'm funnier than that syndrome. It is, in other words, it's your very craft and skill which excite the envy. The very ease, the way in which you make it seem easy is what makes other people envious of your talent. Jokes by others are funny because of all the hidden effort which has gone into shaping them. So if you pick up a book of one-liners and you find one or two of them which are really funny, and you think to yourself, well, I could have come up with something like this. Remember, these one-liners have been honed, crafted. They've probably gone through 25 or 30 performances and were subtly altered every single time or every other time to get down to the diamond-hard clarity which they reach by the time they hit print. Now, the same is true of poems, and for that matter, of novels. In my experience, and I have written a couple of novels, novels go through 5 or 6 drafts before they reach their present state. Nobody that I know of, except perhaps Jack Kerouac, ever wrote a novel straight out and had it printed. And even Jack Kerouac, I believe, did some revision. Richard Brodigan, well, maybe he did some revision, or maybe he did a second draft. You can tell, if you've done it yourself, whether something is a first or second draft, or whether it has been worked over and over and over until it glistens like a jewel in a bed of coal. Perfection in stand-up comedy is elusive because it involves making everybody in your audience laugh most or all of the time at everything you want them to laugh at. Lenny Bruce said something very similar. You should be able to get 6 laughs per minute 90% of the time. Then you can consider yourself a real professional stand-up comedian. If you have a point of view, your material virtually writes itself. That's because having a point of view creates conflict, and conflict is the most vital element in creating a dramatic presentation with the kind of dramatic values which aid in the formation of character and plot. Even if the character is me and the plot is me against the world. If you have a point of view, then that in itself is a big step towards creating new material. It is easy to take familiar concepts and shape them to suit your audience, but your staying power is to shaping your audience to respond to the humor of unfamiliar concepts. In other words, your strangeness is your strength. And that is a quote. Your strangeness is your strength. People who get up on stage and do Star Trek jokes or baseball jokes or Casey Kasem jokes or what have you, well, that's all very well and good, and that's an easy laugh. at least among audiences less discerning than those to be found in Boston or Cambridge. But it's getting the audience to go along with you into unfamiliar territory and making them laugh at unfamiliar concepts, which is the challenge that is before you if you ever want to truly excel in this craft of comedy. It's one thing to go along with the preconceived notions of the crowd and make humorous material which they will go along with, but it's quite another to come up with concepts and subjects unfamiliar to the crowd and get them to change their comic frame to conform to a certain degree with yours. Even if they resist, there is humor to be found even in that process of them resisting what you have to say. Musicians can appreciate the value of practicing to make perfect, which is why I have found them, on the whole, to be big fans of comedy. A great many musicians are, in fact, frustrated comedians, and you will find, if going to see a band, occasionally somebody in the band is going to tell a joke. At least during those intervals when some equipment breaks down, as very often happens at a certain level of the music world. A joke is only as good as its placement, says Mark Stein. And this, again, relates back to what Florence King said earlier on about how you have to come up with some way to put the material into order, because indeed a joke is only as good as its placement. Of course, this notebook is a veritable rat's nest, and it's difficult to come up with another quote. The value of rhythm and understatement in comedy. Even more important, perhaps, than placement is this value of rhythm and understatement in comedy. Now, watch an old performance of Stephen Wright. His whole monologues, the whole pace of his monologue is based on this deadpan, totally deadpan rhythm and this use of understatement, almost to a point where he appears affectless. The man is truly a pioneer, a one-of-a-kind comedian. He was instrumental in creating a whole new type of comedy. Of course, to a certain degree, he has as his ancestor Woody Allen. And to a certain degree, there are two divergent strains of American comedy. There is the anecdotal American comedian, Mark Twain, W.C. Fields, and so on and on. And then there is the fast-paced Catskills Jewish comedian a la Groucho Marx, and then you go on from there. Every single fast-paced comedian, every single fast-talking staccato comedian has as his grandfather Groucho Marx. Easily or not at all, that is the truth about art. Concentration without effort is at the heart of the thing. Will and desire are silenced, as many mystics have understood, and work is transformed into play. You will find, if you ever try to write comic material, sometimes you will be on a roll. Now, Roseanne says this only happens to her about 6 times a year, and I can readily believe it. But with discipline, and in fact with the need to create comedic material, comes an ability to exploit these periods of inspiration. Now, to quote Peter Brownlee, Sid Field thought that part of his success was due to the fact that, quote, I say it different every time. But his humor was not primarily verbal. He bumped into things, or better, avoided bumping into them. He nearly dropped things or nearly broke them. He applied the same approach to the script so that the printed words are but the slightest of guides to what really happened in the theater night after night. So, it's not enough to merely memorize your material cold. You have to also be able to improvise off of it. In fact, you might want to do what I do. Take your material, memorize the phraseology of it, reduce it to a 1 or 2 word stereotype that stands for the entire joke. use that as a crib sheet somewhere, hopefully discreetly out of the view of the audience, and then you will have the placement of the material, you will have the wording of the material memorized, but you will be able to variegate the material, switch things around. It's a lot easier if you do it that way. A funny man, says Mark Stein, is someone an audience is happy to hang out with, even when the funny lines are thin on the ground. Likability comes into it, but also the ability to disguise the comedian's desperate desire to be liked. Some comedians make a career out of showing themselves to have a desperate desire, perhaps not to be liked. Don Rickles springs readily to mind, but of course that is merely a grand disguise. Rodney Dangerfield, same deal. He's not necessarily a very likable individual, but on the other hand, he doesn't have this desperate desire to be liked. At least he doesn't show it. And that's this is very true. A funny man is somebody the audience is in fact happy to hang out with, even when the funny lines are thin on the ground. But some comedians make the mistake of spending 3 minutes getting the audience to like them and having only 2 or 3 minutes to actually tell the jokes, and that appears to me to be a waste of time. You have to somehow be able to come up with some sort of shorthand which renders the audience simpatico virtually simultaneously with your arrival on stage. Now, Steve Saylor talks about Camille Paglia, and a point he makes is also a point which is very important to coming up with comedic material. He says, Camille Paglia's sudden notoriety is due in part to her extraordinary prowess of pattern recognition. She resembles a stand-up comic who's been channel surfing for stereotypes since Sumer. And this is what a stand-up comedian does, basically. A stand-up comedian channel surfs for stereotypes and shows a large degree of what we will call pattern recognition. In other words, a stand-up comedian is a worldly person, somebody who understands the way things work and can also conceptualize them to a degree that he can discern the patterns. I'm very fond of saying that a genius is somebody who can reconcile two opposing thoughts, which is something I believe that F. Scott Fitzgerald and before him Emerson said. You geniuses, all you ever do is take two different things and link them together. Two totally different things. For example, try to link apples and oranges. Well, they're both fruits, and they're both frequently compared to each other. Audacity, says James Bowen, is what it takes to break out of your thraldom to the images of the past. What you want to do is have a thorough grounding in the imagery and images of the past, and yet at the same time, you want to be able to not remain enthralled to them. You don't want to be moaning on about how bad a crook Richard Nixon was, or how Ronald Reagan bankrupted this country, or else you risk sounding like a one-note Johnny. Gustav Eckstein says, clowns are serious actors. Elsewhere, it has been said that stand-up comedy is one of the most difficult forms of acting. You may think that it is, in fact, something which takes virtually no effort to get up there and tell jokes and be funny. In fact, it takes an extraordinary amount of effort to do it well. R.Z. Shepard says that Oliver Sacks, the famous essayist, strongly believes that invention is a measure, if not a definition, of health. So when you're depressed and feeling down and out and miserable, it is in fact very difficult to do anything creative except stew in your own juices. But when in fact you do have a certain degree of contentment with your situation, it is somewhat easier to be inventive. John Cecil says, there is something aggressive about a man rushing onto a stage, telling a string of jokes, determined to make an audience laugh. You feel often as if you have paid to be a captive of the local public house wag. Alternative comedy changed all that. John Cecil goes on to say, what I miss most in the young set is style. Half the fun of the hackneyed old school was in their entrances, exits, bows, and song and dance routines. Visual grace is difficult to achieve. for a man bound to a microphone. So are the skills of timing and pausing in front of an audience of screaming teenagers. Well, John Cecil sounds a little bit bitter to me, but he makes a very valid point early on about the aggression involved in stand-up comedy. There is, in fact, something aggressive about somebody rushing onto a stage, somebody who holds forth, somebody who demands your attention. And to make matters worse, you've paid for this privilege. You're not necessarily being paid to listen to this individual as you might be in certain other jobs. Acting, not prostitution, is the oldest profession. Even apes act, says Marlon Brando. David Thigpen writes, jazz trumpeters who are making a name for themselves are often like a teenager who's got his driver's license. They love speed for its own sake, blowing fusillades of notes that show dazzling enthusiasm but no sense of judgment. And again, you go to any open mic night, not that there are that many in the Boston area, but say back in 1985, you certainly could have gone to any open mic night and you'd find somebody who had reams and reams of enthusiasm and went rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat. They had their material down cold, but they didn't have the judgment to realize what was appropriate, what was apropos, what the audience would react to. They didn't have the sense of judgment to place the jokes in their proper perspective or even in a proper order. And they certainly did not have the wealth of material at their grasp to be able to play a sharp or a flat note as opposed to a simple chord. Now, Sanford Schwartz said of Salvador Dali, his need to be the ringmaster for people he had no respect for. And this is a deadly trap that a comedian can often fall into. The need to be a ringmaster for people you have no respect for. In fact, a great many artists fall into this trap. All of their fans are people they would not associate with on the street, were they in fact to bump into them. Stephen Camphor stated, whatever his excesses, Lenny Bruce was sui generis, one of a kind. There has never been anyone like him before or since. And that, of course, is something that all comedians aspire to the condition of being one of whom it can be said, there has never been anyone like you before or since. And a good example of that is Robin Williams, although of course he acknowledges his great debt to Jonathan Winters. You could take virtually any well-known comedian and trace a certain line of descent. Richard Pryor, okay, let's start with Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy comes out of Richard Pryor, comes out of Lenny Bruce. And you can go on from there. Jackie Mason, says Stephen Camphor. Jackie Mason has reinvented himself, moving from stand-up comic to stand-up guy, speaking for Joe Sixpack and other victims of the liberal onslaught. It is recycled outrage. And it's something to a degree that Rush Limbaugh also does. Jeffrey Cambridge, a well-known comedian of the 60s, says of the craft of stand-up comedy, it's anything, man. Anything that fits the moment. What I do is take the truth and twist it, or I take something which is untrue and take it to such ridiculous proportions that you can see how absurd it really is. I'll take a situation and stretch it until it cannot really hold truth anymore. Now, Dan Aykroyd says, if you're born with it, if it's in the chemistry, in the blood, no matter what happens, you're going to try and see the worst possible world situation as a humorous one. My personal mentor was a woman by the name of Meg Herbie, and she used to do stand-up monologues in front of her college class, which was Wellesley. I believe it was class of '85. And she once stated that every time she read a newspaper, no matter what horrible tragedy occurred, all she could think of was, wow, I can work that into my act. Now, it has been said of Richard Pryor that he was outrageous and angry and willing to put himself into his material, often to the extent of being the butt of the joke. This is, of course, something that Rodney Dangerfield does, that a great many comedians used to do and still do. Lenny Bruce, in fact, was, also very outrageous and seemed to be very angry. Ditto Dick Gregory, yet another person who you can trace a line of descent from Dick Gregory to Lenny Bruce. Right timing in all things is the most important factor. No modern so much in the writing as in the timing. For example, a distance between speaker and microphone of about 9 inches is proper in most cases. This is Jerry M. Goldberg of Pace University's speech department on speaking technique. A distance between speaker and microphone of about 9 inches is proper in most cases. However, this is not a hard and fast rule. Some comedians maul the microphone. They hold it in their hands like a chalice, or they dangle it casually from their wrist, or they have it right up to their mouth, especially if they want to make comic sound effects. Speakers should use normal volume and let the system amplify the sound. Yes, for the most part this is the case. However, sometimes for added emphasis, you can remove the microphone out of your speaking range altogether and shout to emphasize a point. The speaker should use a slow to normal rate of speech, about 120 to 140 words a minute, and short phrases separated by pauses. This compensates for echoes and provides listeners with decoding time, particularly if you're trying to sell insurance to elderly people, as I saw recently an example of on television. Now, Deborah Tannen, who is a noted feminist writer, states that women speak in a way that seeks to build participation and rapport, while men tend to communicate in a manner that asserts autonomous resolve. Now, which one do you think I fall into? And by the way, the reason I'm speaking so fast is because, unfortunately, I have a great deal of material, and alas, not an awful lot of time in which to do it. Of course, if I were smart, I would say, to hell with this 10-week schedule and just do the material at a normal pace of voice and let it spin out to 20 weeks if I so desire. And in fact, I know for a fact that I'm going to have so much material left over that I will have to do that very thing. At this point, perhaps I will take a break. And I actually left some laundry to dry, and I've got to run out and tend to that, and I will be back shortly to conclude the latter hour of this presentation. The Wrong Hero presents the 4th chapter of his course on comedy entitled Stand Up. Hello, I'm back, and I hope you're ready, because I'm ready to speak virtually without interruption for the next 45 minutes or so, to round out this chapter, which is chapter 4 of The Wrong Hero's History of Comedy, entitled Stand Up. Now, some people, I was thinking on the way back from picking up the laundry, don't like comics to be political. They say, well, if I wanted that, I'd read the newspaper. But by saying this, they fail to understand that all comedy is political, because all comedy, all stand-up comedy at least, is about power politics. I have opinions, I'm up here, I'm giving them out, I'm retailing them, so to speak, and if you agree, fine, and if you don't, well, at least I hope I've been able to relay them to you in a way which you consider acceptably entertaining, to the degree that you will be willing to pay to hear them. Anyhow, getting back to gender issues, I do have an entire subchapter based around gender issues in comedy. Once again, quoting Deborah Tannen. Let's see if I got the focus on this right. See, I'm trying to be like scrupulous here. Deborah Tannen says that gender, class, geography, education, and other forces all help determine conversational style. Actually, now that I think of it, not only is Deborah Tannen a feminist of sorts, but also the author of a book or two about the way people interact and talk. It's like her big thing, gender studies, subset, group psychology. Anyway, David Rudnick talks about Newt Gingrich, getting back to politics for a second. Newt Gingrich is the sort of pedant who does not indulge in digression, wit, interpretation, subtlety. His mind is set out like a flow chart, and he is constantly demanding that you follow him through the wilderness. Well, although using a flowchart is a good technique to come up with humorous material, it is not necessarily the best technique in which to present that very same material. The digressions, the wit, the interpretation, the subtlety, that's all a part of the stand-up monologue. So often, says William E. Blundell in his book, The Art and Craft of Feature Writing, so often we must simply see their faces, hear their voices in order to really be convinced of the truth of what we are being told. And so often we do not, because the reporter has failed us as a storyteller. He has not been sensitive to what readers like, to those high interest elements that separate a good story or story idea from a tedious, unengaging one. Well, there is some aspect of being able to pick out the most interesting aspects of a story, which has some application to stand-up comedy, but on the other hand, a good stand-up comedian can make virtually anything interesting, and a good stand-up comedian can take virtually any obscure, abstruse reference or fact and work it into his material in such a way that will create a humorous effect. Well, in a 1909 news article about female comedians, it was stated, a woman is made to be loved and fondled, and certainly she was not made to be laughed at. And even today, some 85 years later, there are still some who believe that women have no place on the stand-up stage. Of course, most of them are about 86 years old. Stand-up comics, says Kenneth L. Woodward, thrive on self-deprecating routines, lamenting the, quote, Jewish guilt or, quote, Catholic guilt absorbed during adolescence. What they're often doing is a riff on religious parents or schools for requiring strict standards of morality that parents themselves often flouted. And, what's more, to go a little bit beyond what Kenneth L. Woodward says, what they don't understand is it's not so much that the education in such places is necessarily superior. In some respects it is not, but the discipline is what sets people apart. And part of that discipline probably translates into the desire to become a stand-up comedian, which is not something that one enters upon lightly as a mere hobby, most of the time anyway. It is something that requires discipline. That's why there is such a disproportionate amount of Jewish and Catholic comedians, because I believe at least the education that they get in Jewish and Catholic schools is such that there is an emphasis on discipline, on study, on work, on craft. Peter Cook, the famed British comedian, stated that life is a matter of passing the time enjoyably. There may be other things to do in life, but I've been too busy passing my time enjoyably to think very deeply about them. And again, that's why people envy the comedian. He appears to have the best job in the world. What does he do for a living? Why, he just gets up there and tells childish jokes and riddles and gags. But there is just so much work involved. John Lahr speaks of Peter Cook, who we just quoted, and states, "The legend of a great comedian dies with him. He lives in the moment, passing time with a generation or two whose deliriums he identifies and sends up. The culture, too, dies a little death and loses part of that promise of delight, which is each funny man's gift to us." Well, I really hate to say it, but most comedians have a lifespan of approximately that of their cohort, say from the ages of 20 to 50. I mean, there are some people still plugging away after the age of 50, but it seems to me they are more of a generic type of comic. They don't necessarily even strictly appeal to their generation. They have the genius to transcend a mere generational cohort. However, these are few and far between. John Cleese talks about Peter Cook. He says, "Genius to me has something to do with doing it much more easily than other people, or, as I've stated repeatedly, at least seeming to." His major comic maneuver, says John Lahr, also on Peter Cook, was to combine the suburban with the surreal. And in fact, you will find this thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure to much comedic material if you care to analyze it to depth and in the process render it no longer very funny at all. He was all the time joking, said Barry Humphries of Peter Cook. He never spoke seriously about anything for a second, so one didn't get near him. And that is a danger, that you're perpetually on stage. One knew one was in the presence of comedy one knew one was in the presence of comedy at right angles to all the comedy we'd heard. And that's what great comedy is. It's at right angles to everything else you've ever heard. Cook's humor, says John Lahr, was not so much a shrewd method of attack as an ingenious style of retreat. And in fact, in future weeks we will be getting into the notion that the artist is in fact in retreat from the very world in which he is supposedly attempting to elucidate for a group at large in the world. One of the ways to avoid being beaten by the system is to laugh at it, said Peter Cook. And again, this gets back to the notion that all comedy, to a certain degree, is political, even if it is only the power politics that the comedian himself indulges in. John Lahr, once again on Peter Cook, like all great comedians, he understood his gift well enough to know that he couldn't reliably control it. Well, getting off the subject of Peter Cook momentarily, Michael Schamberg said something very interesting about the need that actors feel to be liked, and this is also true of comedians. Do you know any actors who don't want to be liked? That is their job. Yes, to a certain degree, the job of the stand-up comedian is to be liked. You're not going to be able to accomplish an awful lot if, in fact, there are a great many people who are dead set against you for whatever reasons, whether it's because you're too good for them or whether it is because you're not really good enough for them. Peter Sellers, says Nigella Lawson, was made for watching. Roy Bolting was right to say that he would have been just as funny in the era of silent films. Now that is something for a comedian to aspire to be made for watching. Lucy Ellman said of Peter Sellers, he suffered from self-hatred and tried to obliterate his own personality through acting. Now there is a profoundly great deal to be said for this particular theory, that many comedians, in fact, suffer from self-hatred and seek to obliterate themselves by creating an engaging comic persona or mask. Now, I'm not quite so sure I understand this personally, this whole self-loathing and a need to have a mask, it just never occurred to me. Now, Steve Allen said about some of his contemporaries in a devastating critique, there is a detectable cold thread running through Johnny Carson's work, although since he is inhibited at all points of the emotional scale, the factor probably goes unnoticed by most of his viewers. Bob Hope's case is far more fascinating. He has never exhibited anything to the public except a strange, almost eerie sort of half-real, half-showbiz geniality. And I perceive such sadness in Carol Burnett's eyes that the smile she might be wearing at the same time appears to be somehow acted, rather like a mask. Steve Allen wrote this in a book that he wrote on how to be funny. And although these observations aren't funny, they are profoundly insightful. Walter Winchell talks a little bit about comic technique and about public speaking technique in general. He stated, "My voice goes up exactly one octave on the air. I want to create as much excitement as a newsboy in the streets when he yells, 'Extra, extra, read all about it!' After a while, most people don't notice this. My voice settles down to normal." Of course, Winchell was one of a kind. He used to keep his pants slightly unbuttoned and would leave his bladder full just before a performance to create a sense of urgency. And it is said that he spoke faster than virtually anybody known. His staccato rhythm ran up to 300 to 325 words a minute. Now, Winchell on his radio show said something which is so incredibly, profoundly applicable to stand-up comedians. And in fact, Winchell himself was in vaudeville as a comic and dancer. Winchell knew. He said, get your audience, keep them interested, sell them an idea in the middle, finish with a great line, and get off for the bows. And that process could take anywhere from 5 to 18 minutes. 18 minutes was in fact the vaudeville term for the featured comic of the evening. And Walter Winchell also stated something which is very true. Once a guy's got a trademark, he's set for life. Now, you only have to consider Rodney Dangerfield and his I don't get no respect line to see the truth of that. Now, we have a non-attributed quote about someone named Daniel Pinkwater. Daniel Pinkwater is a seasoned comedian. He knows that pacing is all, that the name of the game is topping yourself, or sometimes just toppings. Hence the standard comedic technique of doing a great opening line and sort of bumbling along for a while, getting some local color in there, getting to know the audience, and then escalating with one joke topping another until finally you have the killer line of the evening, and that is when you take your bows. In other words, as Colonel Parker said of Elvis, to Elvis actually, always leave him wanting more, which in his case meant trotting Elvis out there for 25 minutes during a concert and whisking him away. Chuck Berry also seemed to follow the same routine. He would do 25-minute sets payable in advance and disappear, much to the predictable consternation of the audience, who probably shelled out a great deal of money to see this legend. I don't know if he does that anymore. I believe he's gone to longer shows nowadays, but he was known for doing this at one time. Well, now we're talking a little bit about depression. We were talking about that stinking wound, Philoctetus, the archer with the stinking wound that makes men shun him, and yet with the great skill which causes men to revere him. And we're talking, when we talk about depression, we're also talking a little bit about the sources of comic energy, or the motivation behind the comic and what he does. Graham Greene said, the disease, depression, is also one's material. Cure the disease, and I doubt whether a writer would remain. That is one reason why Jerry Lewis didn't want to spend too much time on the psychoanalyst's couch, although he did make a movie called Three on a Couch, rated as one of the very worst ever. It's because he was afraid that whatever it was that made him funny, that made people laugh at him, would disappear on the psychoanalyst's couch as he came to terms with whatever it was that drove him. Men of genius, says P.M. Furbank on Mallarmé, the French poet, men of genius often spend much imaginative energy on their ailments and make them a part of a system. Now, I could say, for example, well, even though I have a really fine education, because I'm lower class, I never got anywhere, but of course I'm far too wise to even say that out loud, let alone make that the basis of my worldview. Writers, comics, artists, and philosophers are seen as strange because they operate in the realm of primate brain override. That's my theory. There are basically three layers to the brain. There is the lizard brain, which lizards have. They can distinguish between light and dark, heat and cold. Then there is the mammalian brain, which it gives the organism an ability to regulate the temperature inside of the body, a crucial distinction between warm-blooded and cold-blooded creatures. And of course there's the primate brain, which men share with the apes. The ability to make tools, the ability to remember things that have happened, and a number of other things. But I believe, and this is just one crackpot theory of my own, that there is such a thing as primate brain override. And I don't want to get too political here, but there are a great many people who abhor persons who are homosexual. I am not one of them. But I believe the reason certain people abhor homosexuality is because it does not lead to the regeneration of the race, and that is imprinted in the primate brain. But then I believe that that's a standard deviation in maybe about 10% of the population, that in fact that urge to propagate the race is not necessarily an overriding one, and therefore homosexuality in itself represents a certain primate brain override, and certainly the ability to dispassionately view homosexuality also represents a certain primate brain override. I think the same may be true of racism as well. The ability to transcend racism and sexism may also be a certain primate brain override. The ability to see power structures for what they are and transcend them. The ability to look at somebody and not notice how they're dressed or how they're groomed, but simply see them as the individual they are, which of course mystics and holy men have, can also be laid, I believe, to a certain primate brain override. Now, perhaps you've heard of something called the satiation gene, a gene that says no more. Well, I believe that's absent in some people. And some people, of course, don't have a satiation gene for creativity, and they will be creative regardless of whether it is appropriate to be or not. And believe it or not, there are a great many situations where it is not appropriate to show how creative you are. Overdetermined from without, seeking to satisfy unreconciled ideas, seemed about to make them ashamed of themselves. Well, I don't know. Franz Fanon said that. I'm not quite sure what that means. Faking your way to a high level of trust is particularly ugly and an alienating form of hypocrisy, says Leonard Self. And yet, to a certain degree, that's what a comedian does, is fake their way to a high level of trust. Or if they're no good, they do that. If they're good, they don't have to fake their way. They are intrinsically trustworthy because they have something to say and they are willing to take the risk that is involved in saying it, rather than getting up and merely pandering to the superstitions of a mob. Now, revealing things about yourself, says Alan Bennett, is so difficult. Patrick White said, if words hurtle around me, I can't avoid using them, just as I can't help reflecting a life that seems to be closing down into darkness. Remember, this section is about depression and how somehow depression can drive the comedic instinct, just so long as it is not a suffocating form of depression, which renders a person incapable of doing anything, let alone being creative. If words hurtle around me, I can't avoid using them, says Patrick White. And that is getting back to the satiation gene, a gene that says no more. Some people don't have it. I think writers may not, in fact, have that satiation gene when it comes to products of the imagination. The clown whose public mirth masks private woe is a familiar figure, and one might even argue that it is the perspective on pain that so often propels and inspires humor, says Desmond Ryan. So we can sort of boil down this whole impulse of comedy, wanting to be comedic, as a perspective on pain. Every bit of humor masks a hidden sorrow, said Mark Twain. The altruistic activity affects the brain as much as a drug does. Getting those laughs creates that endorphin high, which once experienced is very difficult to dislike. I think it is what motivates a great many comedians, the altruism gene, wanting to take their own pain and create a source of pleasure for others. And of course, you are rewarded for this by laughter and public esteem. And this is like the runner's high that we so often hear about. And in fact, if you ever were a marathon runner, chances are, if you stop doing it, you miss it. And same is true for any of you out there who are watching this, who were once stand-up comedians and are no longer so. You miss that endorphin high that comes from people appreciating what you have to say and laughing. Roseanne Barr once said, "I'm pure id. And there are certainly a great many comedians who are pure id as opposed to superego or ego. The id, the it, as Freud formulated it, is basically differentiated from the conscience, which is the superego, and the essential beingness of a person, which is the ego. John Updike reminded me of those people who so charmingly laugh at their own jokes while telling them that they seem more likably funny. And this is certainly says Sean French, and this is certainly one technique that stand-up comedians can do, is laugh so affably at their own humorous japes and quips that they become intrinsically likable by that very virtue. Now, getting back to what I was saying about how comedians have their own sort of era in which they operate, and beyond it they frequently aren't able to spread their influence. Well, some comedians recognize that their time among the zeitgeist is very short, so they go into motion pictures. I think Robin Williams is an example. Chris Farley, even for that matter, he did 5 seasons on Saturday Night Live. Then he went into motion pictures, where he appears to be doing very well, and all the better for him. Good luck to him. Denny Kaye, talking about a 40s comedian. Denny Kaye, like a genetic accident, was being conceived on a show business grid that overlapped eras and styles. He would be a show business mutation belonging to no school and somehow being a contemporary model of the classic line, says Martin Gottfried. Just to sort of underline what I was saying about comedians having their own decade or perhaps their own cohort. Some last 5 years, some last 10, some last 20. Matthew Cooper talks about comedians and says, some comedians complain that pressures to create a routine that will fly on national television produce uniformity. In a strange way, you'd think that with more clubs out there to do stand-up, the more creative things would be, says comedian Albert Brooks. That isn't true. And though the week of the comedy, and through the week of the Toronto Comedy Festival, there was a sense that the forces of censorship from both the politically correct left and the religious right were on the march. This is a deadly trap for a comedian to fall in, to allow the politically correct left or the religious right to dictate one's material. However, I do find racism to be highly distasteful, and much of your audience will, as a matter of fact, find it distasteful as well. So if you have a yen to perform ethnic humor, perhaps you should do so at Oddfellows Lodges and the Rotary Club, and because that is really humor of an older generation. Perseverance is the hard work you do after you get tired of doing the hard work you already did, said Newt Gingrich, and that type of perseverance is highly necessary in anybody who intends to become successful as a stand-up comedian. Terence Rafferty, speaking of the film Crumb, about the life of the underground cartoonist Robert Crumb, stated, creativity is a slow, agonizing process of estrangement. Not only estrangement from other people, but estrangement from the material that you wrote down in a white heat of inspiration. And if you were wise, you let it sit for a while before you went back to it to see whether there was anything wrong with it that you could correct or improve. There is something frightening about great comedy, says Terence Rafferty. Now, Kenneth Tynan talks about Don Rickles, one of my favorite comedians, and in fact, perhaps the first comedian I was ever really aware of as a child. His chosen weapon is the verbal hand grenade. At his best, he breaks through the bad taste barrier into a world of sheer outrage, where no forbidden thought goes unspoken, and where everything spoken is anarchically liberating. And by the virtue of that very statement, one can almost utilize this notion to link Don Rickles to yet another great comedian of an earlier era, and I am speaking, of course, of W.C. Fields. Although he has Fields' misanthropic worldview, he utilizes the staccato rhythms of Groucho Marx in order to put them across. His sense of timing, superb, impeccable, just like that of Rodney Dangerfield. If you've been doing this sort of thing for 30-odd years, then you can do it in your sleep, basically. Once you've passed a certain barrier, say 7 years, it becomes second nature to you. Although that is not to say you don't still have stage fright and that you don't still work on your material every single day. Woody Allen, says Mark Stein, has the unprejudiced heartlessness of the professional gag writer rather than the targeted venom of the personally motivated. He is autobiographically revealing not in his content but in its underpinnings. And this is very important, so important that I will repeat it. Woody Allen has the unprejudiced heartlessness of the professional gag writer. Unprejudiced heartlessness. That's what it takes to write what we call gags. And his autobiographical material, it's not directly autobiographical. It's only autobiographical in its underpinnings. In other words, he doesn't say, I did this. He says, I am the kind of guy who would have done something like this. Mark Stein goes on to state that whatever else he is, Woody Allen is a superb craftsman, and craft enables art. Cannot stress this nearly enough. A fellow named M. Wood stated that most of our favorite prejudices are hidden from us. We think they're the truth. Our job as stand-up comedians is to identify these favorite prejudices of the group, the society that we find ourselves in, and identify them, either as, in fact, bearing a great deal of truth or being great falsehoods which distort lives. Humor is always about context, and it's context that decides whether words are offensive or not. Indeed, whether they mean anything at all. Again, quoting M. Wood. Language has tyrannies, and we give in too easily. We often cause pain not because we are cruel, but because we have not understood the narrowness of what we take for granted. And see, this is so true about the neophyte who gets up on stage and does ethnic material without being a part of that ethnic group. We take for granted the notion that, say, Polak jokes are considered humorous without factoring in the notion that perhaps Polish people, and I am in fact half Polish, are tired of being stigmatized in this fashion when there's so many other deserving ethnic groups that might well be stigmatized in a similar fashion, but which are not. Of course, the revenge of the underdog. There were in the 80s a spate of yuppie jokes and, of course, of wasp jokes. I must say, in my own defense at least, that I came up with wasp jokes back in 1978, but since I wasn't on the stand-up circuit, I can't take any real credit for having out and out created them, but I think I may have been instrumental in planting a seed there, somewhere along the line. More than one, in fact. Then again, you never know what you are responsible for creating if you're not actually out there engaging in that world of creativity. We need to recognize, says M. Wood, when we can, the imperial carelessness of so many privileged assumptions and the multitude of differences they consign to the margins of non-existence. See, now that is precisely why ethnic humor is no longer really considered acceptable. Quoting Jim Carrey, who of course is perhaps the hot comedian of the 1990s, so hot in fact that there are people who emulate him, one of whom performs at AS220 quite regularly. Jim Carrey says, the thing about comedy is that there's no sanctity in it. It goes straight to the nerve that's not supposed to be tickled, straight to the thing that's not supposed to be talked about. And that, of course, is very true. And I'm sorry if I sound unimaginative in confining myself to merely affirming what other people have said, but occasionally something is so true that I am left with no recourse but to do exactly that. Now, I was talking earlier about how these endorphins sort of flow once you hear people laughing at you, laughing at your funny material. For a comedian, a laugh, every laugh, it's sort of like a miniature Pulitzer Prize for a journalist. Or, you know, a minute, or at least seeing your name on the front page of the New York Times, you know, an article under your byline. The thrill never goes away. John Lawrence stated that in the life of the comedian, the first laugh is as indelible as first love. Well, I remember the first laugh I ever got. It was the first monologue I ever did, which wasn't going very well. And then I did some spontaneous improvisational thing about monster movies, and boom, I got the laugh. And in fact, my early sets were 5 minutes of struggling with the audience and trying to hook them in and feeling that great satisfaction when finally I did build to a plateau where the laughs did start to come. And sometimes it was like a steady building of a plateau, and other times it was like a roller coaster ride. Certain sets I've done at Catch a Rising Star have been like that. And one never forgets that first laugh. Of course, prior to that, I had done political canvassing door to door and telephone surveys, both very, very fine training for the aspiring stand-up comedian. Quoting Jack Kroll, Jim Carrey brought comedy back to its dumb roots, an explosion of pure energy that's somehow anarchic and innocent, a fusion of vulgarity and grace. And as a matter of fact, Jeff Giles said of Jim Carrey that Jim Carrey may stoop, but he always conquers. A lot of people profess to find Jim Carrey's ability to play the dummy offensive, but of course that's exactly what Jerry Lewis did so profitably for so many years. In fact, from about roughly 1945 to, let's say, 1963, with Cinderfella and the Nutty Professor, 1964. So Jerry had a 20-year run, and a very strong one it was too. And then about that time, he started doing the telethon, and well, he became a showbiz fixture rather than a working comic per se. In a polymorphous, perverse culture, says Jack Kroll, that could well be called eclectic barbarism, Jim Carrey gives us the comedy we deserve. That's what Aristophanes did for his audience, enacting their most disreputable fantasies. Jack Kroll goes on to state, the great physical comics, Keaton, Lloyd, Chaplin, were underdogs who had nothing but their surrealistically resourceful bodies with which to fight the overdogs. Max Sennett, the great comedy director, boasted that his movies wailed the daylights out of authority and pretension. America's silent comedy was the most democratic of art forms, filled with the brashness of a country feeling its oats. Vivian Harvey, also on Jim Carrey, states that Jim Carrey is a glaring comic actor, all primary colors, not pastels, not grays, no subtlety. Well, I'm afraid I'll have to beg to differ. There is a certain degree of subtlety in what Jim Carrey does, even if it is the subtlety of the overstated. One has to know just how overstated to be before one crosses into the realm of the merely grotesque instead of the, at the very least, highly amusing. I'm not quite sure I've ever gotten any real belly laughs from Jim Carrey and his lovable antics. Not at least like I might get from an episode, say, of The Simpsons. Of course, that's more or less sitcom, and we're talking about sitcom and other related phenomena in week 6 of our presentation. Now, Meg Greenfield talks about Bob Newhart, and she says, Bob Newhart could expose the essentially crazy nature of any cherished national custom, institution, or idea simply by causing it to be explained on its own terms to someone who had presumably not heard of it before. And that, again, is yet another very, very fine comic technique to take something which is everyday and common and explain it as though you were explaining it for the first time to someone who had never heard of it. Language, says Michael Wood, always tells long stories if we listen. It's littered with the way we look at things. And that is about as good as any a thing to remember as we get going into the last 10 minutes or so of our presentation. Once again, I am the wrong hero, and now it's time for station identification. You are tuned to Cafe Cabaret. This is part 4 of my course on comedy entitled Stand Up. Now, a familiar downcast wit, that truest form of wit, which, by an unfakeable reflex of the imagination, sees the other side of everything, not just the funny side. There can be something witty in the well-timed glance at mortality. It is sad, so sad, that we all must pass on at some point. But if it weren't for the finite nature of human existence, then perhaps there would be no such thing as humor. You might consider that. Why does your mother always want to feed you? Because she knows she cannot prevent you from someday passing this mortal coil, and she's going to do the best she can to sustain you, she who brought you life, while you are still among us. The best art interrogates and explodes consensus, says John Edgar Wideman. So in other words, it does not mean telling the same old stupid Star Trek jokes to the same old apathetic and indifferent audience. It means interrogating and exploding consensus, exposing the essentially crazy nature of any cherished national custom is a good technique, and once again, one utilized by Bob Newhart. Jim Carrey, once again. My performing started out as a mixture of things. It's really not all angst and I gotta go on stage or I'm gonna kill somebody kind of thing. Some of it is anger, but it was born from really, truly just wanting to be special and to be noticed and wanting to make people laugh. It really was born from that. So it comes from a good place. Once again, the altruism thing going, the endorphins produced by doing something that causes people to look at you favorably. It's just the tools are your anger, the tools are your sadness, the tools are your joy, the tools are voices, faces, the tools are all of these things. So if Jim Carrey had never even so much as made a splash in the entertainment world, if in fact he was widely quoted as having said this, and I believe he said it in an interview in Esquire, he would have contributed a great deal to our understanding of comedy, or if not our understanding, at least our feel for it. I told the truth, said Richard Pryor, even when it didn't make me look good. That's all my comedy ever was. Well, now Nietzsche, in Human, All Too Human, states, one often contradicts an opinion when it is really only the tone in which it has been presented that is unsympathetic. And that is something to remember, that the tone in which you present your material can be virtually as important as all of the other elements which go into the successful presentation of the stand-up monologue. Your timing, or your pacing if you prefer, your sense of placement, your body language, not only your tone of voice, but the tone of the monologue in general, self-pitying or celebratory. If you're happy about something and you can show it, then you can carry the audience along on the waves of your own enthusiasm. Lee Iacocca, who is somebody I don't plan to quote very often, stated, "You've got to know how to talk to them, plain and simple." Adam Bakshian, again, we're talking about the audience now. Every audience gathered to share a common interest or celebrate a specific occasion has a built-in common bond. A good speaker doesn't just know this, a good speaker takes advantage of it. Unfortunately, many stand-up comedians operate in the realm of the stand-up comedy club, and although there are some stand-up comedy groupies, it's a mostly disparate bunch of folks, and yet at the same time, they are all there for the same reason, to laugh. It's very difficult to make people laugh whose only purpose for being there is to laugh. If they're there because they want to learn something, it's a lot easier because once you find out what they want to know, then you can build your material around it in just that way. Johnny Carson once remarked that all great comedians had a, quote, hint of mint. I'm not quite sure what that means. I think maybe a hint of the unusual about them, or perhaps a hint of femininity, who knows. And the same thing applies to comic writers. Well, I think the same thing applies to a great many writers. You really do have to have some sort of plug into the feminine subconscious as well as the masculine in order to really write representational sorts of things. Most comedians are hostile sharpshooters, says John Lahr. Hostile sharpshooters loudly proclaiming their innocence, but Roseanne has got to where she is by biting the hands that have fed her. Family, feminism, and Hollywood. She simply can't see a boundary without crossing it. I think that can stand as the credo of comedians of the 90s, or it ought to, wouldn't it were, that you cannot see a boundary without crossing it. A credo, not the credo, I should say. Roseanne has the rare markings of the true comedic renegade comic spirit, says John Lahr. John Lahr also states, the comic's job is to bear wounds to a world that won't admit its own. And that is so incredibly profound that I may have to repeat it sometime in the future. Of course, we're rounding down now. We're in the last few minutes of our presentation. Roseanne has reclaimed for female comedy the phallic aggression which is traditionally associated with male humor, whose totem, the fool's scepter, is actually the penis, says John Lahr. And now, to round out our presentation, I think we will quote Miss Roseanne Barr at great length. Roseanne Barr states, it isn't a choice. You don't decide I'm going to be offensive or do something that upsets people. It just happens. Sometimes you just blurt things out. And that's where a lot of the risk and a lot of the glory of comedy comes. Without a killing, no feast, as Roseanne also says. People say to me, you're not very feminine. Well, they can suck my dick, says Roseanne. One basic maneuver of comic attack, quote, don't keep secrets. Tell on them. Because they're weak, they can't live in the light of day. I think that's very good advice. Don't ever be afraid of revealing something about yourself that you don't want other people to know. Because in the context of a stand-up monologue, that is not necessarily a bad thing to do. You have to, in other words, use that primate brain override to go against your every instinct, to not say things that people are going to use against you, to not say things that people are going to think are true and are going to judge you on the basis of. When you're a stand-up comedian, you have a special dispensation, so to speak, to say things that ordinarily would not be acceptable to say. Of course, it's difficult to have a regular 9-to-5 job and try out your comic material on people who might take you literally, so keep that in mind as well. Working class people have to work really, really hard for just the smallest thing, so they're stronger. Middle class people are fearful of losing, so everything is about a fear of loss. When everything's based on money, everything's for sale, including their integrity and their morals, says the working class hero, Roseanne Barr. I can't ever let anyone be funnier than me. I just feel like this is war. Again, the phallic aggression that Roseanne Barr has appropriated so successfully. Here's how you can tell if it's funny. If I say it and nobody laughs, it's not funny. And after a good 10 years or so, any comedian would probably be willing to commit themselves to something similar along those lines. If I say it and it's not funny, if nobody laughs, it's not funny. Well, I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but you can make things that are not necessarily strictly funny on the page very, very funny by any of a number of tricks that a stand-up comedian learns how to use. Well, to conclude with a quote from Lenny Bruce, about Lenny Bruce by James Wolcott. Where Lenny Bruce aspired to jazzy virtuosity, Kinison and Andrew Dice Clay strove for heavy metal hegemony, hitting their punchlines like power chords. Gradually, as the comedy scene has lost its flash, pockets of alternative comedy have popped up in places like New York's Rebar, which offers weekly workshops where novice and pro stand-ups take practice cuts at new material. The comics who fall flat are the slackers who come so unprepared that they tend to meander. It's one thing to perform new material, it's another thing to perform no material. Unlike the typical alternative comic, Mark Moran doesn't content himself with hovering over the morning paper. He incarnates the news. And that's as good a place as any to end. I will have to pick up this chapter on stand-up in the following week, which will also be about the comic short story and feature notes on rehearsing. I am the Wrong Hero. You are tuned to Cafe Cabaret. This is part 4 of my 10-week series on comedy. And Cafe Cabaret is broadcast every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. And I thank you for tuning in this evening. And we hope to see you next week, Tuesday at 9 p.m. On behalf of CCTV, good night. Well, it looks as though I have one more minute, actually. So I will read this lengthy quote and hope I can get it all in, also by James Wolcott. And it's a really good place to end. Without the sweaty urgency of the comic, the contorted kabuki faces concealing a sniper's eye, the hint of sacrificial flesh, the words might as well come from Western Union. The brick walls of the classic comedy club served as a reminder that every comic who takes the stage faces a potential firing squad. This risk of public rejection gives comedy its existential edge, even the comics who perform by rote.